more. Our international affairs editor, Rochelle Ferguson Bouyahi, joins me here on set. Rochelle, first of all, talk us through the most recent, if you like, pushback we're seeing in Europe to the US-Israeli war in Iran.
Well, look, Stuart, there have been several pushbacks, you might say, a stiffening of the stance, this resistance to the US and their war on Iran, of course, in conjunction with Israel. You mentioned France there and some of the comments that Donald Trump had made, saying that France was ultimately unhelpful, and that they would pay the price for that ultimately, or that USA wouldn't forget. Let's say, if I'd like to bring up on your screens another couple of examples of how Europe is essentially responding to this. So Paris, not the only country or France, not the only country to close its airspace. Switzerland has done the same. Switzerland stressing that they are, when it comes to armed conflict, taking a position of neutrality. That's a tradition for Switzerland. Spain, of course, has imposed similar flight bans. Now, that's the latest chapter in Spain's hardline stance to this war. If you look at the more dependable, if you will, allies in the past, so you've got Poland that's refusing to relocate its Patriot batteries. There have been several reports that the USA had kindly asked them to at least send one to the Middle East to kind of shore up any difficulties there. That was refused by Warsaw. And then you have Italy that you'll see on your screens, who denied permission for a US military aircraft to land in Sicily. Now, Rome said, hang on a minute, this was a technical hitch. The US hadn't asked for our permission to begin with. But as you can see, a growing chorus, if you will, a growing number of European nations who are making it that much more difficult for the US to forge ahead with this war on Iran. Just a final point on that. The UK now is apparently taking a lot longer to respond to US requests to use its base. So once again, several EU nations taking that stance there.
So bearing all that in mind, I suppose the big question is why then?
Well, look, there are several reasons as to why. Firstly, this lack of consultation with Europe. You'd expect Europe to be consulted if the US is going into a war with or on Iran, particularly because the US needs, EU bases. They need ports. They need airspace. So the fact that they weren't consulted has obviously not been met very kindly by EU leaders. The second we can bring up on your screen as well is this idea of confusion around war aims. What exactly is it that the US is wanting to achieve here? If you listen to Pete Hegseth's interviews, there have been invariably, destroy Iranian offensive missiles, destroy Iranian missile production, ensuring that the country never has any nuclear weapons. The issue, though, is that there never seem to be the same objectives. They are kind of, several objectives that are put out depending on who you're listening to. So the lack of clarity, I think, has, allowed Europeans to kind of have cold feet and really pose key questions about what the US strategy is in all of this. I think the US attitude towards Europe is particularly interesting. The way that Trump has been asking for things, let us use your airbase, let us use your ports. And if that's not met with what Trump is expecting, then there's a slew of insults, criticisms leveled at these EU leaders there. There comes a time when that is going to be, take its toll on European leaders to be, treated as children and insulted, pretty regularly, it has to be said. And the last is, of course, Ukraine. Certainly countries in the east of Europe will want that attention to remain on Ukraine. They are still, battling this full-scale invasion by Russia, and they will not want that attention taken away there to be put on the Middle East.
So where does that leave then the US, and perhaps even more crucially, where on earth does it leave NATO?
Well, look, the first point is that, there's very deep division within the transatlantic relationship is there. We saw that at the beginning of this year. That was put under strain when Trump, broached this issue of annexing Greenland. So there was already a seed of discord, I should say, sowed there. But you mentioned it there. NATO is going to be key here. Marco Rubio most recently has spoken about reassessing the US's relationship with NATO and asking the question of, if we can't use their military bases, if they're not going to help us out, Europe that is, when we ask what is actually the point of being in this alliance, that will crystallise fears for European leaders, because of course they will be fearful that the US might take some revenge. That revenge would probably be in the way of Ukraine spurning their calls for assistance from the United States to continue helping Ukraine to fight Russia. It's a huge fear there from European leaders. Has to be said, I'll just finish up by saying this question of closing airspace and a broad rejection of Donald Trump hasn't yet been broached officially within NATO, but one can imagine that that will be the next step going forward in this war.
Rochelle, thanks very much. Rochelle Ferguson Bouyahi talking to us there from our international affairs.